the evil one of Umbalmeru. The golden brown of the jungle grasses, mellowed at first by the rains and then burnt dry by the merciless heat of the midday sun, covers the sides of the sloping hills that appear to have raised themselves haphazardly in this jungly corner of the land. At the base of each hill, narrow, sharp valleys have been formed by the rainwater during centuries of storms that have burst against the steeper heights and then cascaded in turbulent, muddy streams down the jungle-clad slopes to the valleys below, where, joining together, they have eventually formed the northeastern branch of the Little Kalyani River. These small valleys are choked with undergrowth, cane bamboo, lantana and the clinging vines of the killer creeper, which certainly has earned its name. Years ago some little bird may have eaten a few of its brown berries and had then rested on a leafy perch. The meat of the berries was soon assimilated, and the little bird passed out the undigested seeds. One such seed would have fallen at the foot of the mighty tree where it had rested. Then the rains came and the little seed sprouted and a baby killer was born, no bigger at first than the nail on your little finger. But the seedling grows apace and puts out its tendrils when a month old, thus revealing itself for the first time as a plant that creeps and supports its weight on other plants and trees. It grows and grows, and by the end of the first year it has perhaps climbed a third of the way up the big tree which has sheltered it. But its stem is still no thicker than your middle finger. Within 2 years it has reached the top of the tree, whence its tendrils reach out hungrily towards the neighboring forest giants, all of them, like the host tree, possibly 2 or 3 centuries old. And the stem of the creeper is now about the thickness of your wrist. The years roll by and the creeper has completely covered and enmeshed the old tree that supports it. The stem, which was as thick as your finger and then your wrist, has now become as thick as your thigh, and it continues to grow till it becomes as thick as your body. Its weight is colossal. It has wound even tighter around the trunk and branches of its host, biting through the soft outer bark into the very heart of the wood. Slowly, inexorably, it strangles its host to death. Years later the rains and storms come again. Perhaps on a night very similar to the one on which the killer was born, the grand old tree that had played host to the innocent-looking killer crashes to earth, devoured by the baby to which it once gave shelter. From amid the fallen debris the tendrils of the killer reach out voraciously towards the stems of neighboring trees, there to repeat the grim story and to earn its name of killer over and over again. Because of the heavy undergrowth in the narrow valleys, it is impossible for a man, and almost out of the question for an animal of any size to penetrate the leafy tangle. It is the home of rodents and other such tiny creatures, and the many species of snakes that prey upon them. It is always green there, despite the driest summer months and hottest tropical sun. For the weight of the surrounding hills seems to press the moisture out of the very earth itself, to make slushy marshes in the tangled verdure where the crickets chirp all day and there is perpetual twilight. No rays from the sun can penetrate the canopy of greenery. A moment's delay in sprouting and upward thrusting means that the neighboring bush, vine or shrub has seized the opportunity and the laggard is doomed to an existence of perpetual shade and eventual death from rot and decay. But above the valleys, on the slopes of the hills, it is different. There the sun beats down mercilessly, and in the summer months the leaves of the trees dry up and fall to the ground to form a rustling carpet upon the earth, till the rains bring decay and turn them into mold to feed the very trees from which they have fallen. Higher up on the hills it is cooler and rockier, a region of tumbled boulders and lichens and mosses, while orchids hang from boles and branches, and the large blue-black bird, known as the whistling schoolboy, thrills the listening ear with his wondrous, rambling, warbling notes, carrying never quite the same melody twice. It is shortly after midday when my story begins, and the whistling schoolboy, together with most other birds and nearly all the beasts, both large and small, is taking his afternoon siesta under some shady boulder overlooking the crystal-clear icy cold water that trickles from a crack in the face of a rock at the foot of an overhanging escarpment. Hardly a puff of air can be felt, and the twigs on the trees and the barbed stems of the tall grasses are motionless. It is strangely quiet at this noonday hour. Even the crickets are silent, and not a leaf stirs or rustles in the neighborhood. It is as if all the world had been lulled into a deep torpor. But there comes a faint sound after a while, audible above the gentle murmuring of the waters of the stream as they glide over the smoothly worn, moss-green, slippery rocks that form their bed. It is a staccato, intermittent sound. the noise of someone or something digging, and it comes from the farther bank of the brook and about 50 yards away. A human figure can be seen there, crouched on its haunches and almost hidden from view among the huge leaves of the elephant ear lily that grows in profusion along the banks of the stream. Only the jerky movements, as the man wields his short crowbar, and the sound of the digging itself, betray his presence, for his jet-black body, naked except for a small strip of dirty loincloth, blends perfectly with the dark shadows beneath and around the huge leaves of the lilies. Old Kenneth already has come a long way from his village, the village of Rangampet, nearly 12 miles distant, to dig up the rare bulbs of the Kalu water plant, famed as an aphrodisiac of rare and magical power, that grow here and there among the giant lilies. He has to search carefully for the Kalu water plant, with its three-petaled, shamrock-like leaf, so tiny as to be almost completely hidden from view by its huge bedfellow. And when he finds one, he has to dig deep into the mire after leaving aside the movable stones in order to reach the slender bulbous white roots of the little plant. These roots, when dried thoroughly and later powdered and mixed with male semen and finally treated with magical incantations on the night of the new moon, called Amavasa night, assume their full potency. It is said that a pinch of this powder, mixed with the loved one's food, or better still administered in coffee without milk and liberally sweetened with jaggery or brown sugar to hide the slightly acrid taste, would so excite the woman as to cause her to throw all modesty to the winds, and incidentally herself, unreservedly and unashamedly, into the arms of her eager and already prepared lover. The concoction evidently has some value, or at least a reputation for value, for old Kenneth already had been selling it for some years for 1 rupee per pinch. He is secretly proud of the number of illegitimate children in the village of Rangampet, living testimonials in his opinion to the efficacy of the Kalu roots. So Kenneth already bends himself to the task and digs deeply, while the dull and intermittent sound of his crowbar is almost drowned, but not quite, by the gurgling and burbling sounds from the hurrying waters of the rivulet. And being thus engrossed, he does not notice the malevolently cruel eyes that glare down upon him from a point immediately above and higher up the bank of the rocky little rill. The creature that watches him makes not the slightest sound that might betray its presence. No growl of any sort issues from the cavernous chest and throat. Nor do the eyes blink once in their searching and merciless gaze. The point of the crowbar finally lays bare the tender white roots. Old Kenneth already sets it aside and stoops forward to reach with both hands into the hole he has made to disentangle the roots from the surrounding ooze. The silent watcher above, who has been observing his every movement, notices the action and knows that the man, with his head bent forward and downward, cannot possibly see it now. A red tongue swiftly licks the lips of the upper jaw. Then the creature crouches lower before committing the first of a series of murders that will give it the name of the Evil One, in a score of villages and hamlets that border the 3 forest ranges known as the Bakrapa Reserve, the Chamala Valley, and the Mamandur High Range forests of the Chittor district, now belonging to the state of Andhra Pradesh. A moment later the deed is done. Kenneth already never saw the massive form that hurtled through the air and down upon him, although for a second he did feel its stupendous weight, and the agony from the deep wounds inflicted by its talons as they embedded themselves in his exposed back and sides. But that was only for a moment, because the next instant powerful jaws, armed with massive fangs, crunched through his neck and the back of his skull. So Kenneth already died, and he did not know the moment of his passing to another realm where aphrodisiacs are not in demand and the Kalu roots have no value. It was quite a long time before the old man was missed at Rangampet. It had been his habit to wander off into the jungle to look for his mysterious roots and herbs, or go on a round of the neighboring villages to sell his concoctions and magical powders and charms and amulets, which had spread his reputation far and wide as a great magician, or mantramkara, as he was called. And when eventually he was missed, his bones were never found to associate his passing with the Evil One. But, weeks later, 2 wandering forest guards, who had climbed the slopes of the hill and stopped at the little brook for a drink of its icy cold water, noticed the crowbar and beside it a dirty cloth bag that had been partly devoured by termites, which, however, had not eaten the evil-looking and mouldering roots that now spilled out and lay scattered on the moist ground of the Striambad. Then they remembered that Kenneth already had been missing for quite a long while, causing some people to say he had left Rangampet suddenly and for good. Now, for the first time, the forest guards knew why he had never returned. The tragedy had evidently taken place quite a long while before, and there were no traces to indicate the nature or identity of his murderer. The forest guards duly reported their find to the police chowkee at Rangampet, where a note was made of what they had said. No very definite or proper record was kept of the activities of the Evil One, at least at the beginning of its career, but reports say that the next event occurred in the following manner. It was again afternoon and around 3 o'clock, when a line of 7 bullock carts were returning from the jungle along the rough forest track that led to Rangampet from a well 7 miles away in the jungle at a place called Pulibonu. About a quarter of a mile off the roadway, and almost opposite the 4th milestone from the village, is a perennial water hole known as Nrsimha Cheruvu. The 7 men halted their carts beside the 4th milestone and descended the 2 furlongs to the water hole, chatting as they went, to wash their faces and hands and legs in the limpid, lukewarm brown water, and then their mouths by the simple process of holding a handful of water to their lips, gargling without swallowing it, and ejecting it into the pool. Finally, the 7 men squatted down beneath a babul tree near the water's edge for a brief smoke of beedies. The beedies finished, they got up and returned to their carts in single file. They reached the carts all right. At least, 6 of them did, but there was no sign of the 7th man. What could he be about, and where had he got to? His half-dozen companions, with the stoical indifference and patience of the Indian villager, time being of no consequence anyhow, sat down at the roadside to wait for him and smoke some more beedies. Idly one of them remarked that Patu Reddy, the missing cartman, had been walking last in the file. The speaker had happened to turn around for a moment and had noticed Patu Reddy stop to light a beedi. He was a very heavy smoker. Time passed and the missing man did not put in an appearance. It would have been safe to wait for him indefinitely under normal circumstances. But if they now dallied too long, it would be dark before they were out of the jungle and among the fields surrounding Rangampet. That did not appeal to them. They began to call him, Patu Reddy. Hurry up, man, where the devil are you, Patu Reddy, Patu Reddy. Patu Reddy did not appear. Panic seized the 6 cartmen. It was unthinkable to go back the short distance to the water hole to look for their missing companion. Perhaps some evil spirit had seized him. Maybe a snake had bitten him. Perhaps he had been taken by a tiger, or a panther, or a bear, but the majority of them ascribed his disappearance to supernatural agencies. Within a few moments each of them had scrambled into his bullock cart and the 6 pairs of bullocks rattled off with their carts as fast as they could, urged on by constant whipping. Left alone at the 4th milestone was the 7th cart, Patu Reddy's, the bulls waiting patiently for their owner. He never came. During the night it grew cold and the dew was heavy. The 2 bulls that were still yoked to the cart forgot their owner and remembered the dry, cozy stalls at Rangampet. They traveled through the night and reached the village at about 4 a.m. There could be no tigers about, for they were unmolested. Nevertheless Patu Reddy, just like Kothanda Reddy before him, had apparently vanished into thin air without leaving a trace. When a 3rd man, and then a 4th, disappeared within the next 2 months, people began to say the Chamala Valley was haunted by an evil one, who left no evidence of his coming or of his going, except that he took a human being with him on each occasion. The 3rd victim was a petty trader who had been driving a pack of 10 or 12 donkeys, laden with gram, from Rangampet to a small hamlet 13 miles away to the northwest. He had been seen eating his midday meal at the well at Pulibonu, which was just beyond the 7th milestone along this track. In fact, he had requested one of a number of bamboo cutters who had been camped there to draw some water for him from the well, as he had no rope. The man had obliged and the petty merchant had drunk his fill. Then he had been seen reloading his donkeys and had finally moved off, driving them before him. The following day some other travelers, coming from the opposite direction, had found the pack of donkeys scattered but browsing contentedly in the vicinity of the 10th milestone. They were still carrying the sacks of gram on their backs. But there was no trace of their owner. The 4th man to vanish had done so at Pulibonu itself. And by a quirk of fate he was the very bamboo cutter who had obliged by drawing water from the well for the owner of the donkeys. A party of cutters, engaged on contract to fell bamboos in what is known as a coupe, in the vicinity of Pulibonu itself, had been camping there for over a month. Just a few days after he had obliged the vanished merchant, This very bamboo cutter had assembled with his companions beside the Pulibonu well to eat his midday meal and drink water. Thereafter all of them had returned to their respective tasks. But later in the evening, when the day's work was over, he had not rejoined his companions in the small huts they had temporarily built close to the roadside. Nor was he ever seen again. The other bamboo cutters had not immediately panicked. In fact, the following morning they set out in a body to look for him. They had come to the place where he had been lopping bamboos. A short distance away they had found his koiter or chopping knife. Close to it was the white cloth of his turban where it had fallen off, still shaped to his head. It looked just as if he had taken off the turban carefully and set it aside on the ground, rather than as if it had fallen off. Spreading out fanwise, his companions had thoroughly searched the jungle, the ground, even the leaves of the trees and blades of grass for a clue to his mysterious disappearance. If he had been attacked and killed by a wild animal, there would surely be some traces, a smear of blood, a pug mark, or a drag mark where his body had been hauled through the undergrowth. But there were none of these things. It looked as if he had just taken off his turban deliberately and neatly, laid it on the ground, and then decided to vanish into thin air. But no one would, or could, do that, and in the absence of any trace of violence, the only other conclusion that could be reached, at least in the minds of the other bamboo cutters, was that supernatural agencies had once again been at work and had whisked away the companion just like the petty merchant before him, and the cartman before that. Even their reputed village magician, Kenneth Reddy, had been helpless before these evil spirits or spirit, this evil one, which had now come into their jungles, and had come apparently to stay. Once panic had seized the inhabitants of Rangampet, it gripped them in real earnest. From alarm it soon turned into terror, and it spread through all the villages. The police were alerted, as were the officials of the forest department. Even the collector at Chittor was informed. But the ancients living in Rangampet wagged their heads sadly, if not amusedly. What could the police and other officials do against the evil one? Obviously, the only remedy was to appease the evil one. And the only method of appeasement was by sacrifice, by blood. The police officials in the vicinity grew apprehensive. When the question of sacrifice in a case such as this arose, it was a moot point whether the frightened villagers would consider the life of an animal, such as a fowl or a goat, which were the creatures generally used for a sacrificial ceremony, of sufficient importance to propitiate this evil spirit that now haunted the jungle. They might get the impression that a sacrifice of a higher order was called for. A human sacrifice, perhaps a child. Such things had happened before. So the police staffeder, head constable, who ranked as a sergeant in charge of the tiny police chowkee at Rangampet, warned Krishnappa Reddy, the new village voodoo man, magician and witch doctor combined, upon whose shoulders the mantle of old Kenneth Reddy had automatically fallen as he was the only eligible candidate in the vicinity, that they would lock him up and then hang him if any of the village children were found missing. Faced with this curb to his professional activities, Krishnappa Reddy was not easily upset. Whatever conclusion he reached is not known. It was not long afterwards that Adaraj, the 9-year-old son of a Harijan woman named Adama, who was of the scavenger, or sweeper, class, was reported by his mother as missing from the town of Chandragiri. Now Chandragiri is hardly 6 miles from Rangampet, and is the headquarters of the district. A weekly market fair, called a Shandi, is held there every Monday. The people from the surrounding villages are in the habit of attending this weekly Shandi to buy such provisions and other odds and ends as are not procurable in their own hamlets. What was more to the point, Krishnappa Reddy had been seen by several people at the Shandi on a Monday morning. The small boy, Adaraj, had slept the previous Sunday night beside his mother. On Monday morning he had told her he intended to wander off to the Shandi to see what was to be seen, and he had not been seen by anyone after that. It was not till Friday that Adama screwed up enough courage to report to the police that her son had been missing since Monday morning. The sub-inspector, hot on the scent, requisitioned a jutka, a 2-wheeled conveyance drawn by a pony, and ordered the driver to make his pony go at a gallop all the 6 miles to the hamlet of Rangampet. There he searched Krishnappa Reddy's hut very painstakingly, hoping to find some clue to the missing lad's fate, perhaps a blood-stained cloth or knife, or some part of his anatomy, such as his liver or heart or other organs, as these are known to play an important role in sacrificial rites. But he found nothing. Very indignant and disappointed at his failure, the annoyed sub-inspector took Krishnappa Reddy back to Chandragiri in handcuffs and kept him there over a week. But nobody had come forward to say they had seen him talking to the missing boy, Adaraj. Worse still, nobody could be found who would at least say he thought he had seen the man and the child together. After all, remember, Krishnappa Reddy was a magician. Suppose he laid a curse upon the man or woman who volunteered such witness, false or true, against him. So on the 9th morning the sub-inspector released the magician and told him to walk back the 6 miles to his village, where he was to remain and not leave without the permission of the police. To this Krishnappa Reddy had said enigmatically, "The fox is cunning, but can he outwit a jackal?" The sub-inspector pondered over those words for several days. Had he been alluded to as the jackal? Or was he only the fox? Whatever fate befell Adaraj was never known. But if he had, indeed, been used as a secret sacrifice, apparently the evil one would have no part of him. For within a week the 5th victim disappeared. This time it was a woman. And she vanished near the turning where the footpath, leading to a nullah named Rajamankona, branches off the road from Rangampat to Pulibonu. This turning is within 3 miles of the village. The woman, whose name was Venkatama, had prepared the midday meal for her husband, who had left earlier in the morning with their cattle to graze them in the jungle where he had grazing rights. She set forth at noon to take the meal to the rendezvous they had agreed upon before he left, the sacred peepal tree that grew on the bank of the Rajamankona Nulla, where it dropped some 30 feet into a wide sandy hollow where water only gathered during the rainy season. The man grew angry, because he was hungry, and his anger increased in direct proportion to his hunger, when his spouse never showed up with the long overdue midday meal. He decided to beat the lazy wench soundly when she did appear. That would encourage her to be more prompt in future. But the beating never took place. Venkatama never came to receive it. It was a highly indignant and furious grazier who drove the herd home much earlier than usual that afternoon, both to eat a belated lunch and to administer the thrashing his wife would long remember, instead of just a normal beating, which was the usual corrective. Once again he was doomed to disappointment. There was no lunch awaiting him, and no Venkatama. His little daughter told him that mother had left exactly at noon, carrying the meal in an earthen, chatty pot. Some days later searchers found the chatty pot lying broken beside the footpath less than half a mile from the peepal tree beneath which the herdsman had been waiting all afternoon. But of Venkatama there was not a trace. I came one day with an Indian friend to camp for a week at the forest bungalow at Nagapatla, which is built near the outskirts of the jungle 1 mile from Rangampat, on the track that led to Pulibonu. The manner of my coming and the purpose of my visit on that occasion had certainly been unusual. Although I had brought my rifle and gun as a matter of course, we had not planned a serious hunting trip. My friend, Deva Sundram, was in trouble, and I had brought him to Nagapatla to help him out of it. For, of all things, Deva Sundram had contracted whooping cough, and by his own admission he was 38 years of age. I know little of sicknesses and far less of doctoring. But I understand that whooping cough is a child's complaint and seldom, if ever, affects adults. Nevertheless, Deva Sundram had most certainly contracted it in real earnest from his own little son. All the known remedies had apparently not helped the poor man, nor had they allayed his fits of coughing and wheezing and whooping. I had happened to visit him one evening at his home in Bangalore. He was crouched on a sofa, his eyes popping out of his head, spluttering and making strange noises in his throat. Between spasms he waved me frantically away and stuttered, "Go away. I have whooping cough. If you come near me you will catch it. Go away, go away." His wife anxiously explained that they had tried every remedy on the market and several doctors, but Dev seemed to be getting worse. Now it so transpired that not so many years previously my own daughter, June, and son, Donald, had contracted whooping cough. I had planned to go to Nagapatla on a hunting trip about that time. My wife, who is a bit of a nurse, had thought that the dry, hot climate of the place would shorten the malady and suggested we take the children along. We did so, and she had been right. Both of them had stopped whooping within 48 hours. I mentioned this to Mrs. Sundram. Dev ceased trying to choke to death long enough to listen. Being a lover of the jungle himself, he had just been able to stutter, capital, let's start today, when off he went into another paroxysm of whooping. It was rather funny to watch him and I could barely repress a smile. Later, he told me he did not think much of my sense of humor. However, as a result of all this, we left for Nagapatla the following morning in the T-model Ford I owned in those days. We left Bangalore rather early in order not to expose Dev to the chill of the night air. For the Model T, in spite of all its virtues, is not a fast-moving vehicle, and we would never have reached Nagapatla till late at night, the distance being about 170 miles. By leaving in the morning and chugging along at an average 20 miles an hour, stopping now and then to pour water into the radiator, and for lunch, we got to the bungalow shortly before 5 in the evening. It was noticeably warm even then, and Dev was delighted that I had suggested coming to this place. In spite of the long and somewhat uncomfortable and bumpy journey on the hard springs of the Model T, he had been coughing less since the time we had reached low country after passing Chittor. Eating dinner by lantern light on the wide veranda of the thatched bungalow, I began to chat to the bungalow keeper, a humble servant of the forest department and an old friend of mine, and asked him for Jungli Khabar, the latest news of what had been happening in the jungle surrounding the little bungalow. He was absolutely bursting with excitement and in a torrent of speech began to tell of the exploits of the evil one that had come to the forest during the past few months and had accounted for the disappearance of 5 people already. Mixed with what he had picked up in the way of rumors, and his own conjectures, plus the centuries-old background of superstition and the tales of witchcraft he had learned as a child, the old bungalow watcher told us an interesting and romantic tale, filled with fantastic details of how each of the 5 victims had disappeared. Dev and I were thrilled, and to make it even more thrilling as we listened, a panther began its soaring call as it walked down to the Kalyani River that skirted the forest less than half a mile from where we were sitting. He called, uttering a sound almost exactly like someone sawing wood, only it was far louder and deeper. By his calls we could follow the movements of the panther in our minds, padding softly from bamboo clump to muddy tree, and from the sheltering bushes through the long grasses to the waving belt of rushes that border the banks of the Kalyani and its softly rippling stream of water, that speeds on its way through the dense, silent and mysterious labyrinths of the darkened forest, with only the stars in a velvety black sky to cast their reflections upon the restless current. We tried sleeping inside the bungalow that night, but it was far too hot, with not a breath of air to relieve the stifling atmosphere. Further, the gamboling rats in the grass thatch above our heads squeaked as they chased one another about. Suddenly one of them cried out in fright and then pain. We were both lying awake on the hard-boarded cots that furnished the room. The rat had squealed loudly and pitifully for a few seconds and then stopped. Dev asked me if I could think why it had cried out. To me the answer was only too obvious. It had been bitten, caught, and was now in the process of being swallowed by some snake which had crawled into the thatch for that very purpose. When I told him this, Dev scrambled out of bed and suggested pulling the cots onto the veranda. I thought that a good idea, too. The veranda was not only cooler, but it had a zinc roof where rats would not gambol all night, and snakes would not pursue them. We fell asleep after that, and Dev did not disturb me much during the night. His cough was already better. It was the old familiar call of the jungle cock that awoke me next morning, just as the false dawn was fading, to give way to a short renewed spell of darkness. Then came the real dawn, spreading over the eastern horizon, to outline the distant jungle-clad hills in all the glories of shell pink, vermilion, red and indigo blue, blending into peacock green, tinged with yellow, orange and purple. I had watched many dawns and sunsets before, but I have never tired of seeing another as the golden orb of the rising sun dispels the wreaths of mist that rise from the rich damp mold of the forest. The cry came from south of the bungalow, where the hamlet of Rangampat nestled a mile away. The village rooster, hearing the challenge of his jungle cousin, could not resist the impulse to reply, although nearly 2 miles of cultivated lands divided them. The forest, a mile to the north, awoke to the new life of another day as Devasundram shook his sleepy head and raised himself on his elbows to listen. Called a peacock, fresh from roosting on some far distant forest tree. Spotted deer, frightened by something, insistently cried. Perhaps the panther we had heard the night before was returning homewards and had alarmed them. I fried some bacon on my Primus stove, which we ate with the chapatis we had brought from Bangalore, while waiting for the hot water to boil for the special coffee that Dev said he was going to make that morning. And he carried out his promise. It was delicious. We took a walk into the jungle a little later, going as far as the peepal tree on the bank of Rajamankona, near which the woman, Venkatama, had so mysteriously disappeared. I scanned the ground on the outward journey and the sandy bed of the Nulla at Rajamankona itself, to see what animals had passed in the night. We picked up the trail of the panther as soon as we came to the bank of the Kalyani River. He had been a large male. A mile further on, a female sloth bear had rested under a jumlam tree, while her 2 cubs had frolicked around her. Their tiny childlike footpads were quite distinct on the sand. Isolated sambar, spotted deer and wild pig tracks showed the other beasts that had been abroad during the hours of darkness. But I entirely failed to find what I had particularly sought and had hoped to discover, tiger pugs. No tiger had passed that way. Dev and I returned to the bungalow, swallowed more coffee and then walked southwards to Rangampat. We wanted to hear other versions of the strange tale that old Dadu, the bungalow keeper, had recounted over our dinner the previous night. Both the Patel and village Munsif made us welcome with more coffee, and the villagers clustered around. The advent of visitors, especially from afar, was always an occasion for a chat. The evil one, Dorelu, queried an ancient, bent and tottering and leaning on his staff. Aye, he is in the jungle in real earnest, and has taken 5 people already. But he will never fall to your firearms, sirs, for he will never give you a chance by appearing before you. He is cunning, very, very cunning indeed. Although your bullets would have no effect on him even should he show himself, he will never do that. For you are strangers, foreigners, and different from us. But he will lurk in the jungle, hiding behind a bush or in a hole in the ground, or perhaps he will shrink to the size of a beetle and climb to the top of a lofty tree, where he will watch for one of us, man, woman or child, whoever happens to pass alone. Then in the twinkling of an eye he will change in size and shape. From a tiny beetle he will become a giant ogre. He will seize the unfortunate and eat him up and leave not a trace behind. It will go on like this till we are all taken or leave this accursed forest to him and never enter it again. The throng of onlookers nodded their heads in melancholy agreement. Face to face with such deep superstition, we felt very helpless indeed. I tried to appear disdainful and said, "Nonsense, ancient one, I am surprised that a man of your years and wisdom should talk like a little child. Doubtless it is a tiger or panther that has turned man-eater and is causing all the mischief." He smiled superciliously. "Man-eaters, Dorelu, I have met before. When I was a youth one attacked me at the foot of the escarpment beyond Umbalmeru. Fortunately I was carrying a woodcutter's axe at the time and threw it at the brute. By still greater luck the blade struck it full between the eyes. That tiger's liver turned to water that day. It whirled around and fled. So I am here to tell the tale." He cackled toothlessly at the recollection of the incident. "But this is entirely different, sir," he went on. "Look, you know something about tigers and panthers, and we know you are a hunter who has visited these forests before. Have you ever met a tiger or a panther that leaves no pug marks, no trail of any kind? Not a drop of blood is to be found where any of the 5 victims were taken. Not even a drag mark, where he pulls or carries their bodies into the jungle. If there is a tiger in these parts just now, particularly a man-eater, would we not have found his tracks in the forest, or along the dusty footpaths, in the sandy nullas, or the moist earth on the banks of the Kalyani River? Would we not have heard his moaning calls at night while searching for his prey? And the same goes for a panther, too, although there are some harmless ones around. Besides, as you know well enough, Dorelu, it is not the habit of a panther to drag his victim very far from the place he kills it. For one thing, he has not the strength. Finally, man-eaters invariably strike during the hours of darkness or in the evening, when the shades of night are not far off. But in this case every one of the 5 victims has been taken in broad daylight, and that, too, in the blazing heat of the noon or afternoon, when all carnivora are resting. You can't explain that, can you, Dorelu? But I can, and the explanation is simple and obvious. We are up against the evil one himself, a spirit that can appear and disappear at will, and can assume any form or shape he wishes, from that of an insect to that of a monster, which he is. Your guns will be useless, sirs. For you are not dealing with any flesh and blood tiger or panther. I advise you to go home. Perhaps if you annoy him too much, he may even take one of you, maybe both of you. And so saying, the ancient again grinned mirthlessly. To signify he had spoken the last word, the old man spat a mouthful of betel nut and pan leaf against the foundation of the wall of the Munsif's little brick and mud villa with unerring aim. There was a chorus of assent and approval from the bystanders. Even the Patel and the village Munsif nodded their heads dolefully. Dev and I made our way back to Nagapatla in silence. The old man's words rang in my ears. What manner of creature was this that left no pug marks, no blood trail, no drag mark of any kind, that operated in complete silence, that murdered at the hottest hour of the day? No man-eaters in my experience had behaved in this manner. Yet I knew there was no such thing as an evil spirit responsible for the attacks. There must be a rational explanation. The 5 people had been done to death at irregular intervals. The common factor in each case was that the killing, or disappearance, of every victim had always taken place soon after midday. Secondly, there had been no other human witness to the incident. The disappearance of Kothanda Reddy was largely a matter of conjecture, but certainly the cartman, the trader, the bamboo cutter, and the woman carrying food to her husband, had each been alone. In the case of the petty merchant, his donkeys were with him when it had happened. They, of course, could not speak. Significantly, none of them had been attacked, hurt or killed. And apparently they had not even been alarmed unduly when their owner vanished, for they had all been found grazing closely together the next day. If they had received a fright, they would naturally have scattered in every direction. And most certainly the sudden advent of a tiger, or even a panther, would have scared the wits out of any donkey. We got back to the bungalow where we prepared our frugal lunch. Dev asked me, Jock, he always calls me Jock, for the 28 years I have known him, what do you think it is? It can't be anything but a tiger or panther, Dev, I replied, although I must admit it is certainly a peculiar and unusual beast. There are no elephants or bison in this particular forest, and the only other animal that might attack without provocation would be a sloth bear. And a sloth bear is a stupid, clumsy beast. He would certainly have left some sort of trail. Besides, he would not have carried away the bodies of his victims. He would have left them where he had killed them. After lunch I said to Dev, this mystery intrigues me. I would certainly like to solve it. Tell me, would Leela, Mrs. Deva Sundram, object to you staying another 10 days? He was enthusiastic about it. As a matter of fact, since hearing about the evil one, Dev had completely forgotten his whooping cough, which had almost subsided anyhow. So each of us wrote to his better half saying we were staying rather longer than originally planned. Although we did not say so, we hoped they would conjecture that Dev's whooping cough attack was the only reason for prolonging our stay. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon we were back in the jungle, searching for evidence of a tiger. We found none. We walked up the roadway as far as the 4th milestone and then broke off into the jungle to the east, walking the 2 furlongs to the water hole known as Narasimha Cheruvu. Even on the muddy edge of the pool we found no tiger pug marks. A panther had come for water recently and, of course, quite a number of deer of varying sorts. Instead of returning by the road, we came back along the banks of the Kalyani River. Here we picked up the trail of another panther in several places. He was quite a large beast, and certainly not the animal whose tracks we had found at Narasimha Cheruvu. Perhaps the large panther had been the one that had been calling the previous night. Of one thing we were now almost certain. No tiger appeared to be in residence at that time in that part of the jungle. But there were definitely 2 panthers, probably more. Was one of them a man-eater? If the answer to this question was yes, then there was all the more reason that at least in 1 or more of the 5 instances of the vanished people, some evidence of the attack should have been found. For a man-eating panther, although a deadly antagonist, lacks the great physical strength of a tiger to carry his human prey away bodily. Occasionally he will begin to eat it on the spot, but generally drags the remains into a thicket to consume them there. In either case there would be ample signs for even almost inexperienced searchers to pick up a trail of some sort. We were immensely intrigued. Early next morning we walked the 7 miles to Pulibonu and pursued our inquiries at the bamboo cutters camp, which was still there. Nobody could suggest a rational explanation, and that some malevolent evil spirit was responsible was the universal belief. We searched the banks of the Kalyani, the game trails, and the footpaths that bifurcate from Pulibonu. One of these leads in a northwesterly direction, and it was along this track that the petty merchant had parted company with his donkeys. The other footpath branched off towards the northeast, skirted a rocky pool known as Gundalpenta and led to another pool, named Umbalmeru, at the foot of a lofty, frowning escarpment. It was somewhere in this latter region that the first victim, old Kothanda Reddy, the village wizard, had disappeared. These two pathways, branching off at Pulibonu, form a letter Y with the main track leading from Rangampa to Pulibonu. We had walked along the tail of this letter Y for the 7 miles from the village of Rangampa to Pulibonu. From there we followed each of the top branches of the Y for more than a mile. On the section leading to Umbalmeru we came across the first tiger pug marks. They were some days old, but they confirmed that at least one tiger was in the area. On both the bifurcating sections, as well as along the tail of the Y, we had seen the pugs of panthers, and the imprints of what was undoubtedly an outstandingly large hyena, but no tiger tracks whatever. Dev asked me if I thought the hyena might be responsible for what had occurred, and I very definitely rejected the suggestion. I had met hyenas many times and in many places, and had found them not only quite harmless towards human beings, but particularly cowardly. They would eat only carrion, such as the kills of tigers and panthers, or animals that had otherwise died. I have heard rumors of them encroaching on village burial grounds and exhuming corpses, and I had read once or twice in the newspapers that in certain jungles in Madhya Pradesh they were credited with carrying off children from the outskirts of villages. But in all my experience in southern India I had never heard of even a single case of this sort. The hyenas of the south appear to confine themselves exclusively to a diet of carrion, excreta of any sort from beast or bird, and filth of every description, together with such small animals as rodents, lizards and nesting birds as they were able to surprise and catch. Once or twice they have been reputed to have attacked goats and sheep. We were dead beat when we got back to the bungalow at Nagapatla after dark that evening, having walked a distance of over 18 miles. And we were ravenously hungry, too. Dev and I slept so soundly that night that the sun was shining brightly the next morning when we awoke. 3 days later our friends, the bamboo cutters, provided the first tangible clue to the identity of the evil one. They had finished their felling operations in the coupe near the well at Pulibonu, and the bamboo contractor, who employed them, shifted the whole party to the next coupe at which he had secured the right to cut. This coupe was at the very end of the right-hand branch of the letter Y, after leaving the main path at Pulibonu. It was within half a mile of the rocky pool that bore the name of Umbalmeru, and almost at the base of the lofty escarpment which formed the natural northeastern boundary of the Chamala Valley Reserve Forest, where the evil one at last revealed his identity. The whole region abounds in bamboo and the forest department had apportioned it into blocks or coops. When the stems grow to a certain height and thickness, that particular block or coupe is auctioned for cutting, and the contractor who employed the party of bamboo cutters, as the highest bidder at the auction, had obtained the right to fell and sell the bamboos in that area. Time meant money to him and so he did not delay in shifting his employees to the site where they were to begin felling operations at once. The very first afternoon, one of the men resting from his task had happened to look up. On top of a shelf of rock, and regarding him malevolently, he saw the head and face of a tiger. He fled. The bamboo cutters refused to camp in the forest that night, or any longer for that matter. They told their employer that they would rather walk back all the 12 miles to the safety or Rangampat each evening and return next morning until the coupe was cleared. The contractor was not impressed. He argued that, even walking very fast, it would take them 2.5 hours each way. That meant the loss of 5 working hours every day, which in turn implied that so many less bamboos would be cut daily. The less bamboos, the less money for him, he reminded them. They replied that, if he did not agree, they would quit in a body. Then no more bamboos would be felled and there would be no money for him at all. They stressed that their own lives meant more to them than the bamboos they cut and the money he earned. The contractor tried to compromise by saying he would agree if they consented to a proportionate reduction in the daily wages he was paying them. But the men seemed to him unreasonably determined. They demanded the same scale of wages, threatening again to quit work. Ah, yes, the contractor thought to himself. Times are certainly bad. Labor is getting more unreasonable, more troublesome and more difficult to manage all the world over. If I don't give in, these fellows will leave and then there will be nobody to cut bamboos for me. My curses on this beastly tiger. May it die a very painful death, and that soon. So he agreed to their demand, and that evening at dusk the whole band, including the contractor, came home to Rangampat. On the way they had to pass the gate of the Nagapatla forest lodge where Dev and I were camped. All of them trooped inside, and the man who had seen the tiger told us about it. The contractor also poured out his tale of woe. We were elated. The mystery was solved at last. The evil one was no evil spirit, intangible and unreal, as everyone had thought. It was a flesh and blood tiger, as I had more than half anticipated it would be. The tiger chose to strike the very next day. The bamboo cutters had returned in the morning and were working at their allotted tasks. By common consent they gave the spot, where one of them had seen the tiger the previous evening, a wide berth. The maestri, or foreman in charge of the coolies, announced the midday hour for them to stop work and gather beneath the grove of tamarind trees for their meal, by a series of long, sharp whistles, which he made with the aid of his tongue and teeth. 1 hour was allowed for this purpose, and the bamboo cutters made the most of it. After eating their curry and rice, washed down by bowlfuls of muddy water drawn from a passing stream that trickled from the pool at Umbalmeru, they sat and smoked, or chewed betel leaves, or dozed. At the end of the hour the maestri gave the signal for them to return to work by a similar series of whistles, and soon the sound of the chop-chopping of bamboos, and the crash of falling stems, echoed from the glen in which they were working. But the story of the man who had reported seeing the tiger the previous day made them nervous and kept them unusually alert. And to that fact alone did one of their number owe his life that day. For as he chopped he glanced apprehensively around him now and then. Thus he noticed the slight shaking of some fronds of tender bamboo that sprang from the ground at the base of a larger clump, and the glaring, greenish-yellow eyes that gazed at him hungrily from a background of russet brown and black and white. The man whirled around with raised quoiter just as the tiger leapt. The movement of its quarry told the feline that it had been discovered, and the man was ready to defend himself. It checked its spring in midair by a convulsive twisting of its spinal cord and tail, landing just short of its victim, whose sharp-bladed chopper swished harmlessly through the air, missing the animal by a hair's breadth. But the tiger had no stomach for this kind of reception. It had hoped to seize its quarry unawares. When it landed on the ground it snarled viciously, crouched for a moment as if about to attack again, and then turned tail and leapt back into the bamboos from which it had come and was immediately lost to sight. The man raised the alarm by screaming at the top of his voice, "Help! Help! Tiger! Tiger!" and then made a run for the sheltering tamarind grove. His fellow workers in all directions, hearing his cries, joined in the general pandemonium and stampeded for the tamarinds. The contractor, who had just fallen asleep there, was rudely awakened by the hubbub and the men running headlong through the bamboos till they reached him. There was no thought of work for the rest of the day. The coolies, this time headed by the contractor himself, put the best feet forward to place as great a distance as possible between themselves and the dreaded feline that lurked in the fastnesses of Umbalmeru. Dev and I had had an early tea and were near the 3rd milestone on the road to Pulibonu when we met the chattering batch of men making it a jog trot for the safety of the village. They all began to jabber at once, and it took at least a minute to sort things out and find the man who had been through such a harrowing experience. He described the tiger as having stood, that high, on its 4 feet, indicating his chest as he did so. Truly a brute of mammoth proportions. It was 3:45 p.m. when all this happened. I told the man to hurry, because he was to come back with Dev and myself and show us the spot where the tiger had appeared. I had a reason for wanting to do this. In plain words, I wanted to verify his story if possible, by seeing the tiger's footprints for myself. You must remember that up to that time we had only heard the most exaggerated tales about this weird beast, without the smallest shred of evidence as to its factual existence. and I know from experience to what lengths exaggeration can go when allowed to run riot in the minds of the simple jungle folk. The man was aghast. Go back to that fearsome place. Not on your life. To hell with the very idea. He said all this and much more to me in his vernacular, and I really could not blame him for feeling that way about it. But I just had to have verification of his story. So I got tough. I will not tell you what I said, but in a little while Dev and the bamboo cutter and myself were walking at our best pace up the road that led to Umbalmeru, and from there along the right-hand branch of the letter Y to Umbalmeru. We had 9 miles to cover and we did it just before 6:30 p.m. It would soon be dark, but that did not worry us unduly as both Dev and I had brought our electric torches with us in case we might return late from our long walk. Also, it would not be particularly cold at night except for Dev, who, as a whooping cough patient, really should not expose himself to the night air and the dew fall that went with it. I muttered a word of warning to this effect. Whooping cough, he exclaimed. Who said I have whooping cough? I did have it, but that was long ago. The coolie pointed out the place where he had been cutting bamboos, and the fronds of young bamboo that he had noticed moving and from which the tiger had emerged. We examined the ground around and behind it. In spite of the growing dusk we clearly saw the pug marks of a tiger. Not a very large one it is true, and whether a male or female I could not distinguish because of the fading light and the wisps of fallen, rotting bamboo leaves on which it had trodden. But they were the footprints of a tiger all right. From scrutinizing the ground I stood up a happy and satisfied man. The mystery was indeed solved. The evil one that had puzzled us for so long was nothing supernatural or uncanny. It was just a tiger, but an extraordinarily shy, cunning and elusive tiger at that. Also a coward. We had no bait, nothing to sit up over. Water was to be found in abundance in all directions. To go back to the bungalow meant walking 12 miles in darkness and exhausting our torch cells. So, why not spend the night in the jungle just for the fun of it? We might hear or see something, or we might hear or see nothing at all. At least it would be fun. Better than spending another night in the rat and snake-infested rest house at Nagapatla. I made the suggestion. Dev was enthusiastic. The man we had brought with us was shocked. But there was nothing he could do about it, poor fellow, unless he chose to walk back alone, which he most definitely did not. The next question was where to sit. The pool at Umbalmeru itself would be as good a place as any. At least I hoped we could find a suitable spot there. The jungle where we were was too dense and the bamboos were too close. With nightfall we would be enveloped. It was getting decidedly dark by the time we covered the short distance to the pool. There was no time to construct a hide on the ground, much less to build a platform or macan of any kind on a tree. But a banyan grew not far away, and it was quite a large old tree. The banyan is a tree that drops roots from its branches. These in turn reach the ground, penetrate, and in due course form the trunks of other trees. So the banyan grows ever wider, covering more and more ground, and consists of many trunks, the original parent one and any number of others that have taken root subsequently. A beautiful specimen of this tree, the largest of its kind in India, grows in the botanical gardens of Calcutta. It covers an enormous area. It is one of the landmarks for which the gardens there have become famous. A similarly mighty banyan grows about 42 miles from Bangalore and 2 miles from a village named Tali. A stone temple originally stood at its base. The pendant roots have entirely covered the stone walls of this temple, although its entrance has been kept clear. At a casual glance the roots appear to have formed a natural cave. Incidentally, a black cobra, supposed to be 100 years old, is reputed to live in a hole at the back of the cave. He is fed with bowls of milk and half a dozen eggs at a time by the Brahmin priest who looks after the temple. The priest told me the tree is 2,000 years old. But to return to Umbalmeru. A banyan grew not far from the pool. Not nearly such a large and old one, but it had quite a number of root trunks which had started growing in the ground around the main stem. 2 of these grew about 4 feet apart. In diameter each may have been about 8 feet. We took up our position sitting on the ground between the 2 root trunks. I kept my rifle and faced the jungle. Dev sat with his back to me, facing the pool, and on his lap lay my .12 bore shotgun, loaded with a lethal ball in the right barrel and an LG cartridge in the left. The bamboo cutter sat on Dev's right and faced in the same direction. Dev and I each had our own torches, but whereas I had remembered to bring the clamps which held the torch to my rifle, there were no clamps for Dev and the shotgun. So the woodcutter was to hold the torch for Dev and shine it if occasion arose. Except for our two flanks, protected by the root trunks of the banyan, we were completely exposed and visible. In front of Dev lay the pool. Unless the tiger came along the nearer bank, he would have to cross the water, which afforded some protection. At least we could hear him. In front of me was the jungle into which I could not see once it had become dark unless I flashed my torch. All three of us would have to rely on our sense of hearing alone. The tiger, if he approached either from the side of the pool or from the jungle I faced, would immediately see us. What happened next was a matter of chance and depended on the tiger's courage. Would he attack three men together or slink away? Dev was as elated and as excited as a schoolboy at a fair. In no time it was pitch dark. My feathered friends, the birds, had gone to roost long before we had taken up our positions. After a while the only audible sound was the faraway hooting of a horned owl. Somewhere high above us, in the fastnesses of the towering escarpment, maybe a mile away, he sat complacently regarding the valley that stretched below him. And as he sat he hooted. Suddenly a bullfrog began to croak in the pool. Others joined in, one by one. It became a throbbing, pulsating chorus. The bamboo cutter, whose back touched my left arm, started violently. I could imagine him staring hard into the darkness. But it was only a water frog. Much smaller than the bullfrog and with long, slender hind legs, this species of frog sits half submerged at the edge of pools and lakes. Occasionally one of them will skim across the top of the water, barely touching the surface with violent kicks of its hind legs for some yards, before coming to a halt and floating with its eyes and half its head out of the water. It was this act of skimming or leaping along the water that had made the sound that had caused the coulee to start so violently. I knew that so long as one such frog skimmed the surface of the water now and then, there was nothing to worry about. But if several of the frogs were to do that together, it would be a very reliable signal that something was coming and had frightened them, causing them to take shelter in the middle of the water. The Umbalmeru pool itself is not very large. Oval in shape, it is about 60 feet by 30 feet. At the northern and narrower end it is bounded by rock, being a continuation of the terrain that lies at the foot of the escarpment. On the other three sides is jungle. We were sitting on the eastern bank. It was too dark to see now, but before settling down I had looked up and noticed the escarpment looming above us, perhaps to a height of 500 feet. The bullfrogs croaked noisily beside the water behind me. Otherwise there was silence. Then the horned owl began his eerie call again. In the dell below us a plover suddenly started screeching. Something had alarmed the bird. What could it have been? Almost together, I felt the backs of Devasundram and the coulee straighten and tauten behind mine. But I knew there was time yet. Whatever had frightened the plover, if it happened to be coming towards us, would take at least another 5 minutes, maybe 10, to arrive. A small animal rustled the leaves in the jungle before me. Perhaps a mongoose, or one of those creatures that are distinctly rare in South Indian jungles, a ratel. The rustling alternated with silence as the small mammal stopped its search for food every now and then and listened for possible enemies. Then it began again to scratch the earth and scrape the leaves. All at once it stopped and remained quiet. The 5 minutes were about up. Could it have sensed something approaching? Coinciding with the thought I felt the elbows of both my companions excitedly digging me in the small of my back. Very slowly I turned my head. At first I could see nothing. And then, forming a silhouette like a shifting black blur against the faint lighter outline that was the surface of the water, something seemed to be moving towards us. It merged into a black background of shadows cast by the outer fringes of the main banyan tree and was completely lost to sight. But it had been approaching us when this happened. The thought was a most disconcerting one. I felt certain it was the tiger, and to be helpless in the dark while a man-eater came on and attacked us at close quarters would indeed be an ignominious end. I turned around, balancing on my right knee. Placing the stock of my rifle to my shoulder, I pointed the muzzle in the direction where I judged the killer would be and quickly pressed the button of my torch with my left thumb. The bright beam lit a ghoulish head, from which two bluish-green eyes stared back at me in surprise, fully reflecting the torchlight. But they were cowardly, sly, scheming eyes, albeit a bit foolish in their startled expression. The enormous head, out of all proportion to the sloping body of a large hyena, looked up at us. I could clearly see the long, upright ears, the dark muzzle and the black patch under its throat, although being hidden to us, most of the grey body, with its straggling black stripes, was hidden. I kept the torch burning. All three of us remained motionless and silent. Growled the amazed beast, not being able to understand for a moment the origin of the light, nor its association with human agency. Then perhaps his nose, or maybe just instinct, told him. He snorted, darting to cover with his peculiar undulating gait, caused by his ridiculously short and weak hind legs trying to keep pace with his long and powerful front ones. He ran with an awkwardly loping motion, while the mane of hair along his neck and back stood erect, giving the illusion that he had suddenly grown to twice his size before our very eyes. His grey tail, bristling all over like the rest of him, fanned out behind like a feather brush. The hyena vanished in the undergrowth, but he certainly did not leave the scene. He scampered around us in a wide circle, crackling the thickets as he forced his way through them, while making the most curious and disconcerting medley of sounds imaginable. He cackled, "What have we here?" When he came to the windward side of us and finally got our scent, he was able to realize at last that human beings sat close by. He changed his cries to a series of disdainful remarks, as he scurried about hoping that we would go away. But we did not go away, and he was not happy about it. In fact, he grew displeased. Then breaking into a gargling-like series of protests, in his indignant displeasure at our persistent refusal to budge, he fairly made the jungle ring, scampering around and making his ridiculous noises till we were about sick of hearing him. One fact began to stick out a mile. If we did not drive this garrulous visitor away, we might as well pack our traps and walk back to the bungalow to put in a few undisturbed hours of sleep. "Shoo! Shoo!" I said. "Shoo! Shoo!" cried Dev. "Gee! Po Physic! Go devil!" repeated the coolie. But it was all to no effect, for go he certainly would not. I groped in the earth beside me for a clod, found it and hurled it at the noisy intruder. He made more noise than ever. "Goli achudu theuli melee," advised the bamboo cutter, which means, "Shoot the so-and-so." But he was only a poor hyena, although he was certainly not minding his own business, and I did not want to do so. The din was shocking. The hyena came into view again, a dark shadow against the lighter sheen of the pool of water reflecting the starlight. Just then the tiger growled on the other side of the water. The effect on the hyena was instantaneous. He stopped dead in his tracks, as if turned into stone. His long ears were clearly outlined as he turned his head away to look for the dreaded author of that ominous sound. The next instant he was gone. We heard a scrambling patter for a few seconds as he dashed over the fallen leaves. Then came silence, intense and frightening. We knew the tiger had been somewhere in front of us and across the water when he had growled. But was he still there? He might be, but just as likely he might now be behind us or on either side. For tigers do not advertise their movements as the hyena had done. Or he might have gone away. The hyena had warned him and he knew that all was not well. The question was, would he want to investigate? Or would he slink off, just as the hyena had done? The next few moments would give us the answer, and it was very important to us. So we kept silent and remained watchful. The minutes dragged by and an hour had passed. Except for the distant chirping of wood crickets and the closer croaking of the frogs, there was no other sound to be heard. I began to wish the hyena was back. The noise he had made, although ridiculous, had been something tangible and concrete. But this silence was disconcerting and unnerving. We grew fidgety. Midnight came and passed, and then it became chill. We heard slight rustlings and faint scampering sounds on the dried leaves and in the undergrowth. Rats perhaps, or other small animals, feeding and quenching their thirst at the water. A shadow glided overhead. We heard the heavy flapping of wings. Then came silence again. The horned owl was now our companion. No doubt he knew the time when the small creatures would come for water and thus expose themselves for a few seconds. We never knew when he attacked, but we certainly heard the result. A rabbit called a hare, in India, was the victim. We heard his plaintive scream for mercy as the cruel talons of the owl drove into his tender back, and we heard the faint as the powerful beak struck his skull. Then the hare shrieked no more, for he was dead. The hours dragged by and it grew more chilly. We could not see the sky immediately overhead because of the canopy of branches formed by the banyan, but through the clearing over the waterhole, across which the giant owl had lately flapped his way, we caught glimpses of it. There were no clouds, and 1 or 2 stars twinkled distantly. The clear sky assisted the earth in radiating what little heat had remained since the hours of sunlight. Rapidly it became colder and colder. This caused a heavy dew fall and we could hear the moisture dripping from the leaves of the trees around us, although we were protected by the 2 trunks of the banyan and its branches above our heads. The coolie, poor fellow, was the thinnest clad and he began to react to the cold in real earnest. I could feel him shivering against my back and hear the faint chattering of his teeth. The barrel of the rifle in my hands was like ice and the dew ran down it in a little trickle. I pointed the muzzle downwards to keep the moisture from running inside. To a certain extent the cold discouraged the mosquitoes which had been very active since sunset. Even the faint scratching sounds made by the rats and other small animals subsided. No doubt they were feeling the cold too. The chorus of the bullfrogs died away to a spasmodic individual effort by one or other of their number. It was that hour, early in the morning, when even the denizens of the night appear to rest. After 3 a.m. the wind began to blow. The warm air in the valley below us, which had cooled by now, had long risen from the ground to be replaced by the cold air from the lofty escarpment to the north and northeast. It soughed and moaned and bent the tops of the lesser trees as it blew into the valley in short violent gusts. I began to forget about the tiger and felt sleepy. But it was too cold even to doze. The distant crow of a single jungle cock indicated the time as past 4 a.m. Our vigil was drawing to a close and the tiger had not come. The false dawn came at about 5 o'clock, with its hopes of an early sunrise. Then, as usual, followed a few minutes of renewed, intensified darkness. The faint outline of the summit of the escarpment to the east showed that the night hours were coming to an end at last. The valley below was still enveloped in darkness as the crags above began to show up in the most delicate hues of pale pink, curiously mixed with a mauve and blue background, before which wisps of mist spiraled upwards from the trees growing on the slopes like the smoke signals of a band of marauding red Indians. The rousing cry reverberated across the ragged perpendicular face of the escarpment and boomed with a hollow echo in the wooded valley below. It was the joyous call of the male langur, the large grey monkey with the whiskered black face and abnormally long, curved tail, that lives in the forests of South India, as he awoke to greet the coming day. Soon other langurs joined in and call after call echoed from crag to cliff and then re-echoed across the forested valley to fade away in the distance. It was quite bright where we were sitting, although the sun had not topped the serrated line of rocks and boulders that marked the summit of the escarpment to the east, when at last we rose to our feet, stamped and stretched and yawned to dispel the effects of a sleepless, uncomfortable night, and began the 12-mile march to the bungalow at Nagapatla. None of us was in a good mood, nor did we feel like talking. At the bungalow gates we met some of our friends, the bamboo cutters, who had come there from the village to await our return. "What happened?" asked someone. "Did the tiger come?" queried another. "Did it attack you?" asked a third. "Damn the tiger," I replied crossly. Then, relenting, I told our coolie to acquaint his colleagues with the details of all that had happened. They were discussing it loudly as I placed the kettle on the Primus stove to make hot water for tea. and they were still discussing it when Dev and I tumbled onto the hard beds and fell asleep at once. We slept through the afternoon and awoke about 4 p.m. to eat a late lunch, washed down with more tea. Then we put our heads together to think out some way of settling accounts with the tiger. Marshalling the facts, or rather as many of them as were known to us, we found we were up against an animal that did not follow the normal habits of a man-eater in the least. Firstly, all its human kills had been made in the afternoon, during the heat of the day. Secondly, they were all more or less localized and within a few miles of the Umbalmeru pool and escarpment where he appeared to be living. Ordinarily, man-eaters cover a large area and follow a more or less distinct beat, which sometimes extends for more than 100 miles. Thirdly, those of his victims whom he took he made away with completely and mysteriously. Not a single body had been recovered. Fourthly, he appeared an abnormally shy animal, with more than the usual degree of cowardice that all man-eaters evince towards the human being who fights back. In this case the bamboo cutter had frightened it off with his coiter, while the hyena's warnings of the previous night had caused it to slink away when it could easily have attacked us. Fifthly, it did not seem to have the habit of wandering about its jungle domain as tigers usually do. We had not found this animal's tracks along any of the jungle paths or stream beds which we had searched for that very purpose. Sixthly, we had not received any reports of cattle being killed in the surrounding area. We could make nothing of it, so we decided to do the only possible thing: tie up a live bait or two in the vicinity of the Umbalmeru water hole, although we scarcely expected they would be taken. With this in view we went down to Rangampat village after dinner that night. The villagers cooperated readily, and Dev and I each bought a 3/4 grown bull for the sum, in those days, of about 40 rupees. In English currency this ran to about £3 apiece. One of them was brown in color, the other ash gray. We deliberately avoided animals that were white, or even black, as some tigers shun baits of either color, but especially white. We wanted to take no chances. Having completed the deal, we led our animals back to the forest lodge and quartered them for the night in the motor shed, pushing the Model T into the open. Early the following morning we got busy and with the help of two of the bamboo cutters led our animals all the way back to Umbalmeru. We tied one under the banyan at the side of the water hole, and the other about 2 miles away, near the track leading back to Pulibonu. Here also we tied it close to a selected tree. We did this deliberately so that in the event of either animal being killed, a suitable tree would be readily available in which we could sit and await the tiger's return. All this took us till past midday, so that it was evening by the time we returned to the rest house at Nagapatla. The following morning we used the ford to cover the first 7 miles of rough track to Pulibonu. The car could go no further for the simple reason that the road ended there. So we visited our baits on foot. They were both alive. Untying each in turn, we led them to water, and then retied them, leaving both with enough to eat until the next day. There was nothing more we could do after that. Dev said he would like to visit some of the temples at the town of Tirupati, which was about 15 miles from the bungalow. So we did that. Tirupati is a center of Hindu pilgrimage, devotees coming there in their thousands throughout the year to pay homage to the god Govinda, whose name they keep chanting aloud. All the women who visit these shrines are required to shave their heads entirely as an outward token of having made the pilgrimage. Considering they arrive in hundreds daily, the quantity of hair removed must be colossal. Just before returning we dropped in at the refreshment room on the railway station for tea. No train being due for some time, the manager was at a loose end for the moment. So he came over to the table where we were sitting and opened a conversation to pass the time. In the usual easygoing manner of India he began asking who we were, where we had come from, why we had come, and numerous other questions. Dev good-naturedly gave him all the details. The manager, who professed to know a great deal about shikar, also agreed that the tiger's general conduct was most unusual and not in keeping with a man-eater's normal behavior. Then he said something that made me sit up with a jerk. I wonder if it could be the tigress that escaped some months ago from a circus that came to town. Now it was my turn to ask the questions, and I fairly rained them on him. What circus? How long ago? At which place had the tigress escaped? Had a report been made? Had she been recaptured? He answered my questions piecemeal, and from the information he gave we gleaned the following facts. A small traveling circus with a tigress and a few other animals had visited Tirupati and had camped a mile or so outside town. The proprietor of the circus had come to make friends with the manager of the refreshment room at the railway station because they were not teetotalers, and in a district where prohibition prevails, people who are not teetotalers find much in common in their search for that of which they both feel in need. One evening, after a few glasses had been surreptitiously consumed, the proprietor of the circus had loosened up a bit and had confided to the manager of the refreshment room that 2 nights before the tigress had escaped. The stupid fellow who looked after her had not closed the door of her cage properly. The proprietor had been afraid to inform the police, and as he was a likable fellow, held in esteem among his own artists and employees, he was confident that they would not divulge the secret. Nobody had. A half-hearted attempt had been made to find the missing tigress, but no one appeared to have seen her. As the jungle lies within a mile of Tirupati, the proprietor naturally concluded that his tigress had found her way back into the forest where she would be able to look after herself. He became reconciled to his loss and the circus moved on. I asked the manager if he had ever seen this animal before her escape. He replied that he had, as the circus owner had given him a free pass to visit the show as often as he pleased. She was not a very big tigress, but she was full grown. He added that he thought she was unusually fierce, having often seen her snarling and growling as she ate her usual single meal of beef each day. He also felt she had never been thoroughly broken in, as he never saw her put through the usual acts of circus tigers. A curious thought entered my mind and I asked him, about what time did this tigress receive her daily meal? He glanced at me rather in surprise, but answered promptly enough, in the afternoon, after the circus people had finished their own lunch. The enigma was solved, and the animal's peculiar habits were no longer a mystery. For I was sure now that the man-eater was the escaped tigress and no other beast. She maintained her habit of eating at midday. She was terrified of people, unless she could spring upon them unawares and kill them quickly. She could not hunt properly and hence had not developed a specific line of beat like a normal man-eating tiger. Being fundamentally still afraid of people, she made off with her human kills as quickly as she could, leaving no traces behind, in order to devour her victim very far from the scene of the crime. And, still not completely rid of her habits after living so long in a cage, she had found some shelter for herself, probably a cave, and had made it a permanent abode, instead of wandering from one area of forest to another, after the manner of normal tigers, whether man-eaters or not. The more I thought about it, the more certain I felt that my theory was correct. And her abode was doubtless somewhere in the vicinity of Umbalmeru, probably a cave or rocky hollow of some kind at the base of the escarpment. After all, as the crow flies, the distance from Tirupati to the escarpment near Umbalmeru could not be more than 20 miles, if as much. And that is no great distance for a tiger to cover. I did not confide my ideas to Dev just then, but kept plying the manager of the refreshment room with more questions. But it was soon evident that he had told us all he knew. The only additional information he could give was that the circus had shifted from Tirupati to Renegunta, and from there to a place called Putta, and then to UNKNOW, a railway junction about 40 miles from the city of Madras. He had kept up a desultory correspondence with the proprietor and had received letters from all these places. Then the letters had stopped, so that now he had no idea where the circus had gone. One last thing he told me, and that was that he remembered the tigress had been called Rani. When eventually we left Tirupati after dark that evening to return to the forest bungalow at Nagapatla, I felt our visit had been most opportune. Before dawn next morning we drove to Pulibonu, left the car and visited our baits again. Both were alive and well. After that we scoured several nullas and pathways, looking for fresh tiger pugs and hoping to encounter our quarry. All without result. It was evening when we got back to the bungalow. We had dinner and then went to Rangampa to enlist the aid of a man named Ramia, who had served me on hunting trips in the Chamala Valley years before. I hoped he would be able to help me now. Ramia is a rather extraordinary fellow, at least so far as villagers go. The first time I met him, which might have been 8 to 10 years previously, he had attracted my attention by his quite unusual interest in matters no other villager would have bothered to know. Ramia claimed to have discovered a secret herb growing in the valley, the leaves of which, if eaten, would counteract the effects of the bite of any poisonous snake. He said he kept a stock of these leaves, dried and powdered, with him in his hut, and by means of them had saved the lives of many people who had been bitten by cobras and Russell's vipers, and also of cattle that had been bitten. At my request he had brought me a small plant which I had taken back with me to Bangalore and attempted to grow in my garden. Unfortunately, it died. Ramia had also discovered another herb, a couple of leaves of which, if dropped into a teapot while the tea was being made, vastly enhanced its flavor. I had tried this herb and discovered his claim to be true. He had presented me with a smooth egg-shaped stone the size of a tennis ball which he said would always exude a trace of moisture, particularly in the mornings. I had also taken this stone back with me to Bangalore and found that what he said was true. The strange phenomenon had surprised and interested me enough to show the stone to a geologist at Bangalore. But that gentleman, as amazed as I was, had offered no explanation for the strange occurrence. On one occasion, at the end of a hunting trip, I had offered to pay Ramia for his services. Instead, he asked me to buy a piece of land at the head of the valley where the forest began, which was for sale cheaply, and allow him to cultivate it, and in return he would serve me any time I wanted when I came to Nagapatla on a shooting trip. I had done what he asked and bought the land, which was about 2 3/4 acres in extent, for 50 rupees, less than £4 in English currency. Thereafter, Ramia had cultivated the land rent-free for himself, and had willingly come to my assistance whenever I had called upon him. So we got Ramia out of his hut that night and, sitting on his doorstep, I related what I had heard from the refreshment room manager. I had already consulted Ramia when we had first heard about this killer, but as he had been one of the many who had subscribed to the evil spirit theory, I had not thought it worthwhile to enlist his aid until now. After relating the story of the escaped tigress, I said, I am sure that if any man knows every nook and corner of the Chamala Valley jungle, that man is you. Now think very, very carefully. Is there a cave at the foot of the escarpment in the vicinity of the Umbalmeru pool, or within the radius of 2 or 3 miles from it? His answer came immediately. Why certainly, Sahib. There are, now, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and yes, 1 more, 5 caves, within about the distance you have said. 2 of them are, roughly speaking, to the north, and the remaining 3 to the east. One of the 2 to the north is rather high up on the face of the escarpment. I don't think a tiger would readily use it. The ascent is too steep. I know the langur monkeys play around that cave, but they don't live in it either. All the other 4 would be quite suitable for a tiger to lie up in. I was elated and showed my joy. Good man, Ramia, I exclaimed. Will you lead me to each of them? Surely, Sahib, he assented readily. I have promised to accompany you anywhere you want in this jungle, and at any time, in return for allowing me to cultivate your land, free of rent, these many years. That promise I will keep, Sahib, he concluded simply. I questioned him further about these caves and gathered that 3 of the 4 he had in mind were rather small. The 4th, which was one of the 3 caves at the foot of the escarpment to the east, was considerably larger than the others and had a name of its own, Madapenta, because it was close to a small pool formed by a rill that trickled down the escarpment. Penta signifies a pool. We will be able to visit all 4 of these caves in one day, will we not? I asked him. Surely, Sahib, he assented. The cave to the north is hardly a mile from Umbalmeru. The 3 to the east are from 2 to 3 miles from the water hole, but within a mile of each other. I will come for you in the car tomorrow morning at cockcrow, I told him. Be ready. With an early start we should be at Pulibonu by daybreak. We will walk the remaining distance to Umbalmeru, and from thence to the caves, beginning with the one to the north. As you say, Sahib, he acquiesced immediately. I will be waiting for you. Dev and I went back to the forest bungalow as happy as 2 children. There Dev spent till midnight cleaning and re-cleaning the .12 shotgun. He even cleaned my rifle. The grey-hackled jungle cocks were crowing when the Model T chugged out of the gate of the Nagapatla rest house next morning, and their cousins, the village roosters of Rangampat, had begun to answer them when we arrived at Ramia's hut. It was almost 5 a.m. He had heard the Ford approaching and stepped out of the doorway as I stopped the car. We drove the 7 miles to Pulibonu, and it was 6:05 a.m. when we halted near the well and set out on our walk along the footpath that formed the right-hand stroke of the letter Y and which ran, very roughly, in a northeasterly direction to end at the water hole at Umbalmeru. We arrived at the pool a few minutes before 8, and the sun was shining brightly in a cloudless sky. Ramia told me that from Umbalmeru no well-defined footpath led to any of the 4 caves we were about to search. We would have to rely on his sense of direction alone. And Ramia's sense of direction never failed him. He led the way, armed with his koita, which is a long knife curved at the end, fitted to a bamboo handle about a foot long. It resembled a question mark without the dot at the bottom, but it proved extremely useful when, at times, he employed it to hack a path through the undergrowth. Very often we met game trails leading in all directions, made chiefly, as I could see from the tracks themselves, by sambar and wild pig, with an occasional trail left by sloth bears, which had dug for roots here and there, and had systematically demolished every ant hill in their eager search for termites. But such things did not deter our guide nor cause him to lose his sense of direction for a moment. Onwards he moved to the north with me just behind him, holding the .405 ready against a surprise attack. Dev brought up the rear with the shotgun. The land began to rise steadily towards the base of the escarpment which we could see between the trees, frowning down upon us. Soon the larger trees gave place to more bushy undergrowth and boulders lay scattered about, increasing in size and number as we rose ever higher. I had little doubt these had, from time to time, been washed down from the escarpment by rain and the consequent landslides. Ramia stopped half an hour later and said in a whisper that we were approaching the first of the caves. We redoubled, if that was possible, the caution we had been exercising since leaving the pool at Umbalmeru. The man-eater might be lurking anywhere, without our knowing anything about it. Then Ramia stopped a second time, indicating with a nod of his head, but no spoken word, where the first of the caves lay. And I saw it, the cave, I mean. A pile of boulders had fallen, one upon another, and in doing so had formed a cave. I could see the opening now. Not a large one by any means, perhaps a yard in diameter at the entrance, but big enough to shelter a tiger very easily. Stretching out my left hand, I touched Ramia's shoulder. Then I drew him back and took the lead, placing him between myself and Deva Sundram, still at the rear. On tiptoe, and as silently as possible, taking care not to tread on a dried piece of wood or leaf that might crackle, I inched forward till I stood about 15 feet from the mouth of the cave. Unfortunately, the ground before it was hard and stony. Besides, straggling clumps of spear grass grew everywhere. No tracks would be visible on such terrain. I made signs to Ramia and Dev to pick up stones and throw them into the cave. They understood my signals, and in a few seconds a desultory bombardment began as they hurled stones, big and small, into the narrow entrance. Nothing happened. I could hear the thud as each stone fell, and the clatter as it bounced and rolled inside. Certainly, if a tiger was hiding there, it would either charge out upon us or at least demonstrate in no uncertain manner, by growling. But nothing whatever happened. There was complete silence, except for the thud and clatter of the stones. It began to look as if the tiger was not at home. More stones followed, but without response of any kind. After 10 minutes I was sure the cave was uninhabited. I moved right up to the mouth, where the grass and rubble ended and plain earth formed the flooring of the recess. Still keeping a sharp lookout on the dark interior, I stooped down and glanced at the ground for tracks. There were no pug marks anywhere. The only animal that inhabited the cave, as I could see from his small footprints, was a porcupine, and I knew that no amount of stone throwing would ever induce him to come out and face the bright sunlight. Being a creature of the night, a porcupine can only be smoked out of his burrow, and that with considerable difficulty. Generally, he will prefer to suffocate under such conditions, if he cannot manage to burrow still deeper. Just before we turned away, Ramya pointed upwards to the escarpment. He directed our attention to the second of the two caves he had said lay to the north of the water hole. We could just see the entrance, hidden as it was by the rank grass that half concealed it from sight. The cave looked to be at least 200 or more feet above us and was perhaps 2 furlongs away. Ramya had been right. No tiger would attempt that steep climb. Besides, there was another piece of conclusive evidence that no feline lived in that second cave. A langur monkey sat complacently at the entrance staring down at us inquisitively. If a tiger had passed anywhere nearby, certainly if one was living in the cave, the langur would not be there. They are far too cute to take chances. We made our way down the slope to Umbalmeru and then set out for the 3 caves that lay at the foot of the eastern escarpment. Once again Ramya showed himself a good judge of distances. The first cave took us nearly 45 minutes to reach, by which fact I judged it to be a little over 2 miles from the water hole. The sloping ground and terrain were much the same, but the cave appeared to be a chasm rather than a regular cave, in that it was open at the top and had been formed by a big slice of the rock face that had fallen in a landslide and lay about 10 feet from the base of the cliff. The piece that had fallen looked to be some 20 feet or more in height, and the space of 10 feet between it and the escarpment was what Ramya had called a cave. Being open at the top to admit rain and sunlight, it was thickly overgrown with lantana and long grass. Although a wonderful place in which to hide temporarily, it did not seem a very likely spot for a tiger to choose to live in for any length of time. For one thing, it was too choked with undergrowth. A tiger does not like to make a home in which he himself might be taken by surprise. I told my companions to follow the same plan of hurling stones into the recess while I stood guard over them with my rifle. As expected, nothing happened. After a while we drew closer. The ground was too stony and hard to reveal tracks, but the intense bombardment of stones that Dev and Ramya rained into the gap soon made it clear that the tiger was not there. We skirted the escarpment southward to the next cave, which we reached in about 15 minutes. It seemed to form the exit of some sort of subterranean passage which led into the escarpment. The opening was comparatively small, at most 2 feet across. The usual stoning followed and we achieved a negative result for the 3rd time. Once again the ground was too dry and hard for tracks, so we approached the mouth of the passage and set fire to the grass that grew around. Even if our stoning produced no results, the sight of fire and smell of smoke would bring the tiger out at the double. Still nothing happened. We spent the next 10 minutes or so carefully extinguishing every trace of the fire we had made. We knew too well that a single glowing ember would be quite sufficient to start a forest fire that might blaze for days and destroy thousands of acres of timber. To say we were disappointed would be putting it mildly. We were thoroughly crestfallen. But one cave remained to be visited, the largest of the lot, the one Ramya had called Madapenta. He told us it was over a mile away. With little hope of success we set out for this place. Just before we reached it we came to the little jungle pool that gave the cave its name. And here our hopes soared skyward. Clearly imprinted in the mire at the edge of the pool were several sets of pugs, and they had been made by a tigress. Obviously this was her main source of water. It took another 200 yards, at least, of careful noiseless progress before the cave itself came into view. It had a large entrance, more than 5 feet in width and perhaps a little over that in height. Lastly, it was clear of grass and undergrowth and provided an excellent view of the approach of an enemy to a lurking tigress within. How excellent this was became clear within the next few seconds. Before Dev or Ramya could throw the first stone, there came a thunderous growl from the darkness within, and the very next moment out leapt the tigress. The bright sunlight blinded her for a while. Then her eyes adjusted themselves and she spotted us. She hesitated a brief second, then cowardice, which appeared to be quite strong in this animal's makeup, overcame her. She swerved to her right to make off. At that instant I acted on the spur of the moment. Loudly and sharply, I called, "Rani! Rani!" The tigress halted. She turned to face me. There was ferocity in her countenance, but also a strange expression of bewilderment, recognition and partial submission. But our presence was a riddle to which she never found the answer, 4. Taking no chances, I fired into her chest, following up, as she toppled forward, with a bullet in her brain. She was a young animal, hardly full-grown, and obviously thin and underfed. What had turned Rani into a man-eater? The answer was plain. Years of captivity had rendered her useless at the art of stalking and killing wild game. On the other hand, she was conversant only with the appearance and habits of mankind, although she never to the very end lost her instinctive fear of them. So, in these circumstances, she did the only possible thing to keep herself alive. She killed her human victims by surprise attack, and then took the bodies far away, where she would be safe from the danger of pursuit while she fed. Before closing this story, may I add a word of caution that, of course, will only apply to people living in places such as India, Africa and other countries where wild animals can be caught young and kept as pets. I know a lady who brought up a panther cub until it grew too big and too dangerous to be kept any longer. She was passionately attached to the animal, which was equally fond of her. She would not hear of presenting it to a zoo or a circus, as she was convinced that it would be ill-treated at both places. Shooting it, naturally, was for her out of the question. So she took it by car to a certain large jungle and there set it free. Incidentally, she told me later with tears in her eyes, that as the car drove away, the panther bounded along behind in an attempt to get back to her. I wonder if this well-meaning but sadly misguided lady quite realized what she was doing. She had just liberated a very dangerous animal which she had brought up from a cub upon boiled meat, rice, bread, pudding, porridge and what not, omitting to mention such delicacies as sweets, ice cream and things of that sort. This unfortunate creature was totally unfit to look after itself and catch and kill its legitimate prey. There were just 3 things that could happen to it, and all of them most unpleasant to contemplate. It might approach the first human being it met in a friendly spirit and be killed for its pains. Secondly, it might starve to death, although this is very unlikely, for when driven by hunger the instinct for self-preservation would become so strong that the panther would eventually kill something. Thirdly, and worst of all, the animal might become a man-eater. She told me what she had done less than a week after she had liberated her pet. I advised her to scan the newspapers closely for the following month or so. I did the same. Within a few days we both read a short announcement that told of the strange behavior of a very emaciated panther that had wandered into a village, which was within a few miles of the place where she had liberated her pet, and gone to sleep inside a grass hut. Then came the sad part. The villagers had closed the door of the hut, poured kerosene oil over the thatch and set fire to it, burning the poor beast to death. The lady was heartbroken at her pet's horrible end. But I wonder what she would have felt had she read instead that it had become a killer of men, forced to the pernicious habit by her foolishness in setting it free when it was totally unable to fend for itself. The end.